Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'd like to welcome many of you to AEI's new home and also to the first Bradley Lecture of 2017. Many of you know the Bradley Lecture series began almost 30 years ago with a lecture by Irving Kristol on Adam Smith and the future of capitalism. And we've been at it, as I said, for nearly 30 years, and we're very grateful to the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for its continuous support of the series. Next month, on February 21st, our former colleague and good friend Steve Hayward will lecture on his new intellectual history of two giants and sparring partners, the late Walter Burns and Harry Jaffa, both of whom died 2 years ago on the same day. These two individuals and some of their colleagues had an enormous impact on conservative thought and on the historiography of the founding. I've asked my AEI colleague, Fred Kagan, to introduce tonight's lecturer, Graeme Wood. Fred is a resident fellow and director of the AEI Critical Threats Project. If you haven't signed up for his weekly Critical Threats update on the Al-Qaeda network, you should sign up for it. It's easy to do on AEI's website. And the Critical Threats Project is an important initiative for AEI and for the country. I hope you will join us after Graham's lecture and question and answer session for a wine and cheese reception where you will be able to purchase copies of Graham's new book, and he will be available to sign it. Fred.
Thanks very much, Carlin. It's a great privilege to be able to introduce you tonight, Graeme Wood. Speaking on an incredibly important topic. You could pretty much always have been able to say that since June 2014, that ISIS is an important topic and that anyone who helps us understand it more deserves careful hearing. And that's Graeme. Graeme has really done an amazing job of helping to unriddle the complexities of the motivation and intentions of an organization that has befuddled a lot of people, including people in senior decision-making positions. Graeme has had a fascinating background and career. As he just told me, he cut his teeth in Cambodia, working a local media, or not necessarily local, I suppose, national media initiative in Cambodia. So you can see he takes all of the easy assignments. He holds the Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow position in the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also, I'm delighted to say, a lecturer in political science at Yale University, a very distinguished institution. He has attended other distinguished institutions as well as Harvard. The topic of ISIS and the general topic of what has been called the war on terror, the war against radical Islam, various different things, is something that's been very much in the news. We have a new administration promising new approaches. I'll let Graeme talk about how he sees that evolving and what he expects to see. But I do want to take the opportunity before you very briefly to mention a couple of things about this that I find incredibly important. The first is, I think it's becoming more important than ever to remind ourselves that although this is a problem within Islam, and it is a problem that is related to and springing from elements in Islam, Islam itself is not the problem. And we make a grave mistake if we identify the religion as the problem here without understanding a lot of nuances and complexity that Graeme has articulated and will articulate for you, I think, extremely well. And the other thing is that although Graeme is going to deliver a presentation to you on ISIS, which is an incredibly important organization, it is also important to remember that ISIS is part of a larger movement which it shares with Al-Qaeda, with which it also competes, and with other organizations with which it competes and interacts. We have become so narrowly focused on ISIS over the past few years in our discussions that we often lose sight of the larger what we call here the Salafi jihadi threat. I was talking with Graeme about the degree to which that is or is not an appropriate moniker for it. But the larger problem, and that's something that it's very important to bear in mind. This is a critically important piece of a larger picture, but it is a piece of a larger picture. Nevertheless, it is the one that is occupying our attention. It is the one against which our troops are fighting and our leaders are focused. And so I am thrilled to be able to invite to the podium Graeme Wood to talk about it.
Thank you very much, Fred. I thought the Al-Qaeda-ISIS rivalry was acrimonious until I remembered Harvard-Yale a few minutes ago. That's serious. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Thank you also to Danny Pletka and Carlin Bowman of AEI for the invitation to speak tonight. I have very warm feelings about AEI. After my time in Cambodia, when I was a young and not especially well-paid journalist in DC, the events at AEI were always the ones that were most intellectually engaging and also often the best catered as well. Lots of free food, and I sometimes wondered whether this is what conservatives favor instead of expansion of SNAP benefits, is very well catered events like this. So I'm grateful for the AEI friends that I made then, and more recent acquaintances like Fred, Danny, Leon Aaron, Catherine Zimmerman, and Sally Satel. So this is, for reasons that Fred alluded to, in a way a very strange time to be someone who focuses his study on jihadism. In the early part of this decade, when I was doing the early research for what would eventually become my book, The Way of the Strangers, jihadi studies was, in a way, a kind of lonely domain. There were many analysts of Al-Qaeda, but for the general public, the attitude was, in a way, could be summed up by the update, Osama bin Laden is still dead, which was a nice thing to hear. But in the meantime, the US government became pretty effective at stopping threats, disrupting overseas plots, and professional analysts, of course, were still urging eternal vigilance, but the attitude of many was, in a sense, eternal vigilance is what we pay you guys for. So it kind of receded from the general public's consciousness. And now, after that period of loneliness for people in this field, we now have a president who has promised to shape his whole foreign policy with the overall goal of defeating jihadism, defeating, as he puts it, radical Islam or radical Islamic terror. And the jihadologists who were watching Al-Qaeda during this period, who were watching the precursors of the Islamic State, are suddenly finding that there might be something worse than being neglected. That is, perhaps having the object of one's study elevated to the status of an evil fetish, while the insights that were gleaned in those quiet, lonely years of analysis are ignored in favor of distortions and simplifications. In that way, it's better to feel vaguely neglected than to feel aggressively conscripted into a policy that has, from what little we know of it, just a few days into this presidency, assimilated very few of the lessons that we have learned thus far, after a decade and a half of thinking about the jihadist threat. I take the policy, from what little we know of it, to be roughly as follows. Recognize the threat of a broad coalition of Islamic terrorists, motivated by a sincere belief in the rightness of their version of Islam, counter it with decisive, pitiless military action, and support autocrats such as Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt and Abdullah II of Jordan, who have pledged to persecute the jihadists alongside us. Those autocrats may even include Bashar al-Assad. In the meantime, we should lock down America, have Fortress America, leaving overseas action to our proxies, and perhaps severely limiting immigration by Muslims. Perhaps even keep closer tabs on Muslims we already have in this country. These are the policies, as I understand them, to have been articulated. I believe, though, that these policy points, they add up to something less than a coherent and wise foreign policy. And to explain why, I will shamelessly promote my book, The Way of the Strangers, which is available in the lobby and from fine booksellers everywhere. The book is my attempt to imagine myself into the mind of an Islamic State supporter. At times, this exercise involved reading Islamic State propaganda, watching their videos, listening to their radio station, and basically trying to tailor my media diet so it resembled that of an Islamic State recruit, the type of person they were trying to lure from London, from the Rhineland, from Moscow or Tunis, to join them in an early death in Syria or Iraq. In the early days of recruitment, when a mere 20,000 people had gone, not the 45,000 who have eventually gone, I could actually go online. I could watch these conversations unfold. Any of us could have gone onto Twitter and seen the tweets one by one in real time appear as someone in Raqqa was trying to lure one of his buddies in Birmingham or in Portsmouth or in Paris. And then, most important, I tried to find people who were in these demographics and interrogate them in person. I looked for people who openly prayed for the Islamic State's victory, people who had urged others to go and were taken seriously by others, people who had actually sent those people to their deaths, and people who had tried to travel or who had actually traveled to Raqqa themselves. I resolved in this process really early on to be simple, to be direct, honest in my interactions with them. I wanted to know their answers to the basic questions that sort of define us all. Who are you? Where have you come from? Where are you going? What do you believe? I was willing to suspend for that moment of discussion moral judgment of them, but they weren't stupid. They knew that I was opposed to them, and if I asked them to be sincere about their view of me, they would say that they viewed it as permissible to kill me. So that sense left a fourth question that I almost didn't need to articulate, but often did, which is, what is wrong with you? How did you come to these beliefs? Why are you so strange, so weird? And in almost all cases, even that relatively aggressive question was received with equanimity. They would be actually quite nice and willing to talk at great length with me. The first conversations I had were actually that went into this process they actually took place in Cairo before the Islamic State ever existed. In Cairo during the Arab Spring, I came to know a follower of the man usually referred to as the blind sheikh, Omar Abdurrahman, who is, and this man, this follower, he sort of fancied himself a master recruiter for the cause of jihadi Salafism. He was in his 50s, a little guy, very unimposing, but also kind of wily. He was by profession a tailor. He had lived in this country. He had a shop near the United Nations building and lived there for several years making suits for Paul Newman, among others. So for reasons of sport, I allowed myself to be worked over by him and by his friends over the course of long discussions about theology, about Islamic scripture and history and law. The conversations were a hobby for me, sort of like a particularly intense book club. And for them, it was a battle for our souls. For mine, in the sense that I was certainly doomed if I didn't follow, and for them, in the sense that they believed that they would be asked on the day of judgment about what they told me. That when I came to them, I had asked them for answers, and if they hadn't given them, then they would be held to account for that negligence. When eventually the Islamic State was declared in the middle of 2014, I asked this tailor what he thought of the group. By then, Sisi was in charge in Egypt. He had cracked down quite severely on Islamists, and he would have been exposing himself perhaps to some danger to tell a journalist that he had pledged allegiance outright. So he said he wasn't sure what he thought of the Islamic State, but it was clear from their success that they were theologically sound and that God was with them. So they had won the coveted Allah endorsement in his view. By that time, I had begun watching the Islamic State in earnest, and with the help of other individuals who were in that movement, I began to see that there were distinct people, identifiable people, who were doing on a massive scale what this tailor had done for me, which is to recruit, to disseminate information, and eventually to get people to travel to fight for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. It was never in any doubt what they were ultimately recruiting me for. They would often say, if I asked them, "Are you part of ISIS yourself?" They would say, "Absolutely not." Or they would say, as in one case, I asked, "Have you pledged allegiance to ISIS?" The guy said, "Well, it would be illegal for me to do that, so I'll just wink at you right now, and you can take that to mean whatever you think it means." And then he had an exaggerated kind of stage wink like that. So they had established digital and physical recruiting presences in their home countries in the UK, Scandinavia, Belgium, the US, Australia. And they played a very particular role in the Islamic State. They weren't sleeper cells, they were open. And in some cases, although they were in some cases in direct contact with people within the Islamic State. I could tell because they were as open as showing me their telephones with, again, identifiable people who they were conversing with and who were already over there. Their job was to be not sleeper cells, but awake and to be public. They were the translators, the people who understood the Islamic State, who loved it, who accepted the greater responsibility. Sometimes that was delegated to them almost officially of spreading its message and convincing others to travel and fight for it. The records of those conversations, the most interesting among them, constitute the bulk of my book. I went to London, Melbourne, Tokyo, various European cities, and I found people through the most mundane methods, by tweeting at them, by Googling them and finding that they had once put a post up on a bulletin board and their email address was still active, even just by going on Facebook and looking for people who had as their profile photos images of the Islamic State's flag, who had, and if you then went to their profiles, you could see that their friends included people who were posting original photographs from the Islamic State. So not terribly hard to find them. And when I reached out to them, rather than their needing to be persuaded to speak to me, as I say, it was familiar from that previous set of conversations in Egypt. They were speaking to me with a feeling of obligation, that if they didn't, they would be called to task for it. And their patience for my questions was, to my surprise, almost inexhaustible. Probably the most influential guide to my thinking was a guy named Robert Cherantonio, known to me by the name Musa, Arabic for Moses. The Australian media knew him as a local firebrand preacher, and he was definitely that. He had converted from Catholicism as a teenager. He spent a year in Cairo hosting a TV show about Islam. Eventually, about during that period, he radicalized. The TV station stiffed him on his last paycheck, sent his staff to beat him up when he complained, and he developed a long-standing hatred for Egypt. Instead, moved to the Philippines, connected with Islamists there, and was deported to Australia after attempts to get to Syria by the time I met him. Australia's foreign minister, in her wisdom, she canceled his passport, and so he was there, stuck, a free man, and therefore available to meet me for a number of lazy afternoons, playing soccer, drinking coffee, hot chocolate in Australia, his infidel homeland. The Islamic State had asked him, he told me, to be its official English language voice, a translator of its official statements. He was already doing that job pro bono, in a way. When a message came out from the caliph or from the caliph's spokesman, he would immediately sit down with his dictionary, translate it into idiomatic English, and send it back into the Islamic State's propaganda machine to be published, typeset, illustrated. And he was doing it very well. The spokesman of the Islamic State would sometimes, Adnani in particular, would use poetic language. And Musa was good enough at his Arabic to do that justice, to translate it in a way that really gave the rhetorical flair its due. So the answers to the basic question that I posed, who are you, what do you want, where have you come from, where are you going, they're now, I think, better known to us, the broader public, than they once were. This is, too, in the field of jihadi studies, a kind of strange moment. It's a strange feeling to have a sense that some of these niceties of ISIS ideology are well known. It reminds me when I came to DC after years in Iraq in 2006, I would find people who I was sure would not know the difference on a map between Wyoming and Colorado know certainly that Tikrit was south of Mosul, for example. Now in 2017, I would find people who, if they were Christians, they wouldn't know the difference between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but due to the propaganda of ISIS, they would know in Islamic eschatology whether the Mahdi appears before or after the return of Jesus as a Muslim warrior. So Musa gave me the positive view of the world that he attributed to ISIS and that he had followed. And it was a view of Islamic revivalism. It was cast in clear prophetic terms. He had about the caliphate what I think of as a kind of field of dreams attitude. If you build it, they will come. They, in this case, was Mahdi, the Mahdi and Jesus, in that order. The it was a political and religious entity that was modeled on Muhammad and the immediate successors of Muhammad, that is, the rightly guided Sunni caliphs, with all the customs and legal conventions of the day. Musa said that the appointment of a caliph or imam was an obligation upon Muslims, and the community of Muslims had collectively sinned by neglecting it, and that individuals, at that point, once it had been established, were individually sinning by not going to follow it themselves. And if they died in this sinful state, they would be dying a death of disbelief. Their souls would be imperiled. He did not conceal, he didn't hide his disappointment in the mass of Muslims who greeted Baghdadi's call for immigration with scoffs. He said to me, Islam began as a minority movement of strange people with strange beliefs who were eventually driven from their hometown of Mecca into a strange land, Medina. So why then should modern followers of a righteous movement that was following Muhammad's model be surprised to find themselves mocked, driven from their own home countries? These are the strangers. The strangers are the title of my book. They would cheer on the revival of practices like sex slavery, cross amputation, which is the amputation of a hand and its opposite foot, which is the penalty in the Islamic State for brigandage. And if I told them that to me these were abhorrent or disgusting practices, they would say, first of all, they were obligations in their religion, but they would also add, sort of sympathetically to me, because they were Australian, they were American, they were British, they were people who also had the kind of instinctual sense that sex slavery is not a good thing. They would say they knew that they were strange. These practices sounded strange, and that strangeness was not a curse. Virtually everyone I spoke to had, in the kind of near horizon of the mental view of the caliphate and what it would become, a belief that it was also deeply associated with the end of time, that the apocalypse was part of what they were in for. I met an old man in Norway. He was born in Algeria, and he related to me what many other people did in piecemeal, but he went through the whole catalog of prophecies, saying that very calmly how the prophecies of the Islamic State had been fulfilled, that of Islam had been fulfilled in the form of the Islamic State. There had been a reestablishment of the caliphate. There had been a reinvigorated sense of Islamic morality and law, and retro modes of warfare, such as fighters on horseback or swinging swords. These had also come back, as had been prophesied. Additionally, there were other general markers of a world that was near its expiration date. He said, look, we were told that there will be a time of rampant immorality. There will be a death of expertise. And, people who know nothing will speak as if they did. So, like this is the prophecy of the blogosphere, we could call it. And there would also be this is probably the most commonly quoted prophecy: the competitive building of towers by herdsmen, which they point to the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. They say, this is it. These are people who are just a generation or two outside of pastoralism, and now they're building towers at a world competitive height. This is something that had been prophesied as a sign of the end of times, And sure enough, here it is. They also said that we had entered a time of war, and this strangeness that they had described, that they themselves felt, would only increase. So governments would fall, miraculous interventions would favor Muslims at times, and at other times favor their enemies. There would be plagues, human and non-human, that would blanket the earth, and the stink of death would pervade the planet. I asked Musa whether he thought he'd live to see these events, and he said he prayed to God that he would not. Indeed, he quoted to me a famous hadith about the end of time, saying that a man who passed a tomb during these days would say to himself, "I wish I were the one who's buried there." So all of this, I know it sounds pretty grim, but I have to say, it didn't feel so at the time. These were conversations with human beings, and they were greased with big servings of lamb, pots of tea, and they were not solemn at all. They were in a spirit of friendly human interaction. And I dare say that of the 45,000 people who have gone to the Islamic State, not all of them could have been convinced with a kind of a diet of complete solemnity and seriousness. If the pitch were unremittingly grave, even inhuman, it would not have been nearly as appealing. What surprised me, as much as the content of these conversations, was the ease that we got along, with which we got along. We were able to talk to each other very comfortably. We shared the same references. We had the same taste in food and popular culture. We could laugh at the same jokes. Musa Cherantonio's Wi-Fi password in his house, which he shared with me when we showered at his house after playing 5-on-5 soccer with his little jihadist soccer club. This Wi-Fi password was a Monty Python reference that I think would make more than a few people in this room laugh. So in this geek, I felt a kind of kindred spirit, to a degree. There's a line in 1984 that occurred to me many times when talking to supporters of ISIS. Winston Smith is under interrogation by O'Brien, the sadistic bureaucrat who's torturing him. And O'Brien seems to have really penetrated the mind and soul of Winston Smith, and to have understood him better than he understands himself. And O'Brien says, "I like talking to you, Winston. Your mind resembles my own, except that you are insane." And of course, I asked myself, am I O'Brien or am I Winston? And I didn't find either comparison especially reassuring. So there's a line in the Quran that says that God is as near to you as your own jugular vein. That line is invoked by Muslims, not only ISIS supporters, to remind that God is all-knowing, is omnipresent. And I found that contact with supporters of the group, which is quite possibly the most evil on the planet, left me with a sense that they were not aliens, but kind of disconcertingly human. They weren't mentally ill in any diagnosable sense. There's some exceptions to this, but in general, I would say that's true. They were people who had come to grotesque conclusions after feeling familiar kinds of human insecurity about their place in the world. They answered these insecurities like feelings of longing to be part of something greater than themselves, the desire to experience perfection in this world after disappointment and flaws in this fallen one that we all live in, and a sense of powerlessness that they had before in the face of injustice. They felt all of these things, and they resorted to the standard human toolkit that we all have in dealing with them, which includes recourse to religion. As every serious inquiry into the motivations of ISIS fighters has found, including in a fine paper that was released only today by Lauren Dawson and Amar Amarasingam, every serious inquiry finds that religion for them is not an afterthought. It is, as these two authors say, the dominant frame that these foreign fighters use to interpret almost every aspect of their lives. It doesn't mean they're scholars. It doesn't mean that their Islam is the right one, or that Islam requires one to do what they've done, but it is a central motivator. That sense of jugular closeness is something that only increased as I investigated them. Every time I talked to them, I felt more like this was someone who was part of my mental world and not part of an unknowable alien evil one. Part of what interested me was the kind of intellectual genealogy that they represented. There was a sociology of knowledge here that had somehow brought this idea, this really difficult to come to on one's own idea of what a caliphate is, had brought it somehow all the way to a cafe in Melbourne, Australia, and then finally reached me. So part of what I ended up doing was to try to trace where that was. What was the lineage of education, the dissemination of knowledge that had led that far? I asked Musa this question, and he said that his teacher was someone named Yahya Abu Hassan. He told me that Yahya Abu Hassan had a virtuoso knowledge of Arabic, history of Islam, theology, law. I was doubtful. I looked at some of Yahya Abu Hassan's writings online and found they were indeed quite impressive. They were impressive to Muslim scholars to whom I showed them, who said it's completely crazy, but it's also brilliant. In those discussions, so it took me months of inquiry after that, looking for people who were his students, or who I suspected were his students, haunting online jihadist forums, and browsing for any leads with this name, Yahya Abu Hassan, not being very uncommon as an alias. And then I discovered he was an American citizen. And not just any American citizen, but one whose last address in this country was about 20 minutes drive from where I grew up. This realization is kind of like that horror movie cliche where the victim asks the police to trace the scary phone call and is told that the call's coming from within the house. It's like the jihadism is coming from within your school district. So, but that was the core discovery here, was to understand that he had an upbringing that was not so different from people who were perhaps in this room, perhaps known to people in this room. He came from a wealthy and loving family. His father, a retired Air Force colonel. His mother, a housewife. They're Trump supporters, devout Greek Orthodox Christians. And their son dabbled in various forms of rebellion, and then really picked up a doozy of a form of rebellion, which is jihadism, to which he devoted himself after his conversion in his late teens. Very smart kid, maybe too smart for his own good. He was a pretty avid dope smoker through his 20s, even after his conversion. And he even wrote a learned treatise justifying the use of cannabis on Sharia grounds. This was the person who Musa was reaching to as his guide through what would eventually, determine the fate of his soul. It's what was extraordinary to me in learning about him was to find that he was someone who was pretty much just a guy on the internet, a guy whose learning was real. He had actually done the work of study, but who was coming from a different lineage of a different scholarly pedigree from what had been offered to Musa and to others when they converted to Islam and when they were looking for sources of authority. Instead, he was someone who had established himself in a kind of radically democratized playing field of scholarship, where one didn't need to get the seal of approval from Al-Azhar University or from the University of Medina or from regular scholars, but instead, suddenly anyone could approach the texts and read them for themselves. And Yahya Abu Hassan had absolutely done that. In 2011, he traveled to Cairo, lived there for a while, was already too far gone down the jihadist line to even get his own talk show, as Musa had. And in 2013, he traveled with his family the family of 4, into Syria. The wife and the kids eventually kind of chickened out, decided they didn't want to die quite so soon, and went back across the border into Turkey and left him. But Yahya Abu Hassan has fought. He was wounded, his spine nearly severed in a mortar attack outside of Aleppo, He was imprisoned by the Free Syrian Army for some time and was, during that period, probably tortured, I think, as well. And eventually, by the middle of 2015, he made it to the city of Raqqa. And I was able to see some of the writings that he's had from there because he has become probably the most important English language voice in the Islamic State's propaganda, this kid from Plano, Texas. He is one of the lead writers of a magazine that some of you might have read called Dabik, completely unrepentant about any of this. And again, as American as it gets in some ways. He has this view he has a view of Islamic law that I would characterize as the Texan libertarian subset of radical jihadism. And what you can tell from reading his writings is that there is no reconciliation that is possible with him. He is never coming back unless it's in the custody of some heavily armed people. There is no solution. Which brings me back now to the policy of the US that it seems to be taking under this administration. I laud the new administration in recognizing that there are indeed some irreconcilables, people who cannot live harmoniously with the rest of the world and whose rejection of our shared values is so complete that they must be fought pitilessly. These are the people to whom I've spoken and to whom they look for guidance. I don't expect any of these people to come home, and when they die, I expect them to die happily, smiles on their faces, like the martyrs that they think they are. In that recognition that the enemy is indeed an enemy, this new administration's policy is pretty much exactly the same as the previous one. What's more disconcerting is the way that the policy is, I'm told, to be put into practice. One element of this is an incrementally sped up advance toward Raqqa, the de facto capital of ISIS. Already Mosul is falling at great cost and kind of in slow motion, but I definitely celebrate that along with the eventual liberation of Raqqa. What I don't observe in these new policies is an accompanying realization or appreciation of the textures of the appeal of the Islamic State as a movement that has penetrated the minds of a small number of dedicated Muslims globally. To take out the centers of planning and leadership is great. It's a necessary step. But we're facing something that's bigger and whose remedy is far less obvious. After the last time I saw Musa, he texted me and he said, why don't you come by and have another conversation? It's obviously a big step for me to go all the way to Australia, but I thought that sounded good. But I had to postpone our conversation by a week and a half, which turned out to be fateful. It was just a bit too late. Right after we were supposed to talk, he was caught in the northern tip, northwest or northeast tip of Australia, trying to put a boat into the sea with 5 of his friends, the soccer team we had once played with, to sail to Papua New Guinea and eventually to the southern Philippines. Once there, I think he intended to serve as kind of the mufti of his own private island, like the feudal lord of the most distant possession of the Islamic State. And now he's on trial back in Melbourne. So I don't think that his plan would have worked out as well as he planned. But what I think it illustrates is how quixotic ISIS supporters can be and how resilient in the face of local setbacks or even setbacks in their core territory. I am in favor of dealing them setbacks wherever we can, but I have to kind of temper and moderate this zeal with a recognition that ISIS will survive no matter how we pursue it, and the plan to manage it after Raqqa and Mosul is more important in the long run than the plan to take back those cities. ISIS is like herpes, where it can be managed but never cured. We can deal with the current outbreak with balms and salves, but a prudent policy has to involve working on a longer-term strategy to limit those outbreaks altogether and to manage them when they happen. Managing them includes noticing the way that they have taken advantage of human psychology and of political communication. They have said very clearly that they want people to attack whenever they can and with whatever magnitude that's available to them. It does not require the taking down of a whole building. All it requires is a kitchen knife and the willingness to die today. What that means is they realize that they can provoke immense terror with the most modest means, which means that a key aspect of managing these attacks when they happen is the, I think, political responsibility of leaders to contextualize the attacks when they inevitably can, because kitchen knives will always be available, and to ensure that the fear that the attacks provoke does not exceed the reality of the threat. And this task, the management of fear, is one that I don't think any government so far has successfully managed, and that most of them have botched pretty severely. Which leads to the part of the plan and policy that involves the support of autocrats in ISIS-affected regions. And they are ISIS-affected regions. These are the front lines of this battle. And I'm talking about places like Sinai, and there will be more to come. I think of Sisi of Egypt, whose name, by the way, is literally ISIS backwards, as the current administration's ideal partner in fighting ISIS. It's the partner that the administration wants and wants to see more of, wants to clone elsewhere. In my experience with ISIS supporters generally, with the Taylor of Cairo specifically, makes me think that that plan is bound to fail very badly. Sisi will relentlessly pursue ISIS as it threatens him. But the longer view of ISIS and an understanding of the idealism of its supporters goes unaddressed. Among the hardened core of ISIS, these irreconcilables, are many people who they have longing for justice, as I say, for membership in something greater than themselves, and that these longings, I think, could be addressed with political change of a type that Sisi emphatically does not represent. The desire for justice, say, is not one that is systemically addressed by a military government in perpetuity, a constant state of emergency. And the hunger to belong to something greater than oneself, it's something that I think can be satisfied by a sort of a taste of liberty, that is, a freedom to pursue one's own goals and dreams unencumbered by the state. And whatever Sisi and his ilk offer, it's not that. It's not liberty. I'll take questions in a second, but I think I'll preempt what I expect to be the hardest one, which is, what do I think should happen? What is the solution? As a journalist, my standard reply to this is to say, my job is to just talk to people and tell you what they say. The problems of the world are in someone else's department. But I know you'll find that unsatisfactory. My notes toward a coherent policy would certainly include a military component, probably looking similar to what we currently have. It would also, though, have to include an effort, using whatever tools we have at our disposal, to make the lives of people who are vulnerable to the Islamic State's recruitment and message more likely to be fulfilled in this deeper sense, and more likely to be hopeful, and more likely to be free. That is not, as I understand it, the current policy of my government, but it is the beginning of the one I'd like to see. So thank you very much.
Graeme, thank you for a really magnificent presentation of a really complicated topic, and it really, I think it's really important the way that you brought together the psychology of this, and the ability, the issue of the ability to understand these people as humans, which I have a background as a Sovietologist, and I can quote Marx and Lenin, and I can go down that whole path while remaining a staunch capitalist. And it's a very important skill. And I think you also remind us of the banality of evil in many respects, which is such an important concept that is also lost, that people can be rational and evil, that they can logically come to incredibly evil and horrible conclusions based on a different set of assumptions and a different set of predicates. And it doesn't make them insane, and it doesn't make them stupid. It just makes them evil. And of course, highlighting the importance of the different motivations, which you've touched on, but which I think we could expand a little bit more on. I'll give you an opportunity to do that in a minute, but I also ask you what I think is an even harder question than what do we do about this. But it's not just Islam that's motivating these people. Islam is important, but as you say, it's also what's happening to them. Some of the most chilling reading that I've ever done are the speeches of Jilani, who is the head of the Al-Qaeda group in Syria. Because those speeches describe a Syria with which I'm very familiar. They're accurate in their description of what's going on in Syria. They're accurate in their description of chemical weapons attacks. They're accurate in their description of Russian coalition bombing of bread lines and hospitals and deliberate maiming of children and all of these. They're accurate in that. And so they're mobilizing based on a version of reality that is unfortunately not that divorced from reality. And those motivations, before we even get to the question of fulfilling lives, and I think that's important, the question of survival at all seems increasingly to a lot of people to be at stake here. And so I think one of the huge values that you bring to this discussion is to force us beyond, all the way into, through, and then beyond the ideological component of this, to say, yes, that's incredibly important, but there's another component of the psychology here that's incredibly important as well. And we really have to be addressing both of those in order to get to a solution. One of the hardest problems is to say what we should do, but I find, as we're often tasked with this, the hardest question to answer is, what does victory look like? Or how would you define success? How will we know that we have managed the herpes virus? And I have no problem calling these guys herpes. That's anything that offends them is generally good with me. But what does long-term management look like if it's successful?
I think of support for ISIS as something that has a lot of characteristics of changing style. That is, when there was a period that I described when you could just watch how the recruitment happened. And it was clear that the ISIS proposition that was being offered was, we are the coolest way to do what you want to do. Like, there are other options out there, but we are the meanest product on the block. So I think what success looks like is for them no longer to occupy that position, and in fact for them to occupy a position of much lower social status. There's a story that's well known in the countering violent extremism community. India has an enormous Muslim population, has sent very, very few fighters to ISIS. Why is that? Well, one of the best known stories of the fighters who have gone from India is that a few of them came back having discovered that on arrival, instead of being given suicide belts or Kalashnikovs or the tools of glorious combat, they were given a toilet brush, a mop, and they were given the least glorious kind of role in the caliphate. So when they came back, and it was known to everyone who might be in the demographic that wanted to go to India, that they would, they'd have fingers that smelled terrible at the end of the day. This was enough, I think, to make people really laugh at them. That's what I would look for, much more so than numbers of battlefield deaths that are inflicted by them, numbers of events, is that the moment when it is no longer an attractive proposition to join ISIS, but one that you know will get your peers back home to laugh at you.
So I'll come to your questions in the audience. These are the ground rules. I will call on you, wait for the microphone, state your name and identify yourself, and make your statement in the form of a question, please. Over here.
Thank you very much. This thing about offering people, John Graham, National Center for Policy Analysis, but this is not my area of expertise, so ignore that statement. I'm a health policy guy. This thing about letting them want to be an environment where you can be free and in liberty. On the one hand, a guy who's born and raised in Australia or Texas, I don't quite see how we can do better on that front. But people who are born and raised in Syria or Egypt or whatever, haven't we kind of tried that? in Iraq and in other countries, you have an election and you end up electing guys that, it doesn't have to be Winston Churchill, but, the guys you're electing are pretty bad characters. So can you flesh that out, please? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very vague policy, I know, to give people a sense of fulfillment in their lives. As far as I know, governments in general have not been great at doing that. And ISIS is no better than others, but it had a moment when it was able to propose itself as a possibility. Now, what that will actually look like, as you point out, there are people who will, no matter what you offer them in terms of opportunities, material opportunities, they'll long for something more. But I do think that the sense of despair that's detectable in a place like Cairo after the high water mark of the Arab Spring is exactly the type of environment that produces a desperation that is looking for something else and not something material. These are people who, their view of winning is death, and their view of part of their view of the eschatology of their success is complete failure as well. So I think that we'd have to think again in a much broader systemic way. But what is it that will create a space where people can find something that they will enjoy in their lives and that will fulfill them? If I know how to do that, then I would be I would occupy a more illustrious perch than the one I'm at right now.
Allow me to be your wingman in this, because this is a really important question, and I'd like to just offer a different perspective as someone who studied Iraq for a long time. Elections, of course, we know elections are not equivalent with democracy, and elections are also not equivalent with representative government. And unfortunately, in the case of Iraq, the person who was elected and whom the United States then supported unequivocally, even as it became clear that he was moving in this direction, was a sectarian dictator who systematically undertook to persecute the Sunni minority in his country. And that, of course, is Nouri al-Maliki, who's now attempting to make a comeback into this position. And he long held the support of the Bush administration and then the Obama administration. He was democratically elected. He was also a sectarian dictator. And he played a critical role in persuading Iraq's Sunni, especially after the withdrawal of US forces, that he was an existential threat to them, that the government in Baghdad posed an existential sectarian threat to their existence. In that respect, he was an Iraqi mirror of Assad, although he never went to that extreme of what Assad has been doing. It's not clear to me that he was ever unwilling to do that, but he didn't have the chance. This is something that we should really very much keep in mind as we reflect on the desirability of allying ourselves with Assad or with Assad's partners to suppress the Sunni majority in Syria. Because as you talk about why there aren't a lot of recruits from India, I was told, and I can't, this isn't to my own knowledge, but someone who I believe knows it, the problem in Bangladesh. Why are we seeing radicalization in Bangladesh? And I'd be interested in your thoughts on this as well. But part of the problem is Bangladeshi expats who worked in the Gulf, where they were certainly treated badly, because if anyone's ever been to the Gulf, you understand how Bangladeshis and Pakistanis and so forth are treated there. But that wasn't the problem. They had gone to the Gulf, they had worked as remittance workers, they had sent a lot of payments back to their families and so forth, and they had returned to Bangladesh radicalized because they had come to believe that the Sunni community faced an existential threat in the form of the coalition of Shia, Kurd, Russo-Iranian, and American coalition that seemed to be attacking and invading it. And so these are people who, by Bangladeshi standards, are doing pretty well, who were not persecuted, except were treated badly, but that wasn't their problem. They're being treated badly by fellow Muslims. That wasn't their problem. But it was this sense of an existential conflict. And I think until we wrap our heads around the fact that we fuel this fire by supporting what looks like a global crusade against the Sunni community, we're going to continue to be pouring kerosene on it. That's my view. Please react if you disagree or if you agree.
Yeah, the one thing I would add about the position of Bangladesh and ISIS's strategic view, Bangladesh is a place where there's been political instability for, shall we say, quite some time. And ISIS's view is that if there is such a place, then that is very fertile ground for it. They have been aiming to find places where there is endemic corruption, where there is a sense of dissatisfaction with the local authorities as they are constituted, and where ISIS can be the beneficiary of an increase to the level of chaos and distrust. Bangladesh is a perfect case of this, but you can also see it in exactly these traits in, say, northern Nigeria, southern Philippines, and if you can find a place that have these attributes, and also that they have Sunni Muslim majority, then you can pretty much map out where ISIS is planning its next peripheral moves.
Mike up here.
Alexis Savchenko, if I understood correctly, once ISIS emerged, the sex appeal of Al-Qaeda dropped dramatically among the foreign volunteers. If Raqqa is going to fall, once it falls, basically, and ISIS is going to be wiped out, at least in Syria, do you expect that new wave of foreign volunteers is going to join al-Nusra, or they're going to look for some other outlet? Thank you.
So the question is whether I expect that the fall of Raqqa and Mosul will mean that foreign volunteers will instead go to al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. I think the most important thing to note is that right now there are very few foreign volunteers who are actually going. The flow of foreign fighters has dropped so dramatically that it's fairly negligible, the number that would be diverted then to Nusra. But yes, obviously the market share is traded between the two entities. So I do think that Al-Qaeda would be a big beneficiary of ISIS's lowered status.
Okay, in the back over here. Right there. No, right, sorry, behind you. Yep, you got him.
Thank you.
Welcome
Hello,
to
Mike Webb.
Congrats.
I'm nobody. But question. There we go. I like your, diagram in terms of it being a question of irreconcilables. In a lot of those situations, sometimes people reject the messenger and thereby reject the message. And also, they kind of talk past each other because you just have this wall. Is there, a type of leader that we can present to kind of, like soften that message? So this way they're not rejecting things immediately.
All right, so is there a leader that we could present that would be more able to create a reconciliation? First of all, there are always irreconcilables in any conflict. So when I describe that in the case of ISIS, it's not to say that they're unique in this way. ISIS has been trying very hard. That one of the main goals, I think, of its propaganda is to increase that segment that is irreconcilable. To say that there can be no budging on theological issues, there can be no change to your allegiance once you've made it to ISIS. It's one of the real differences, I think, between Al-Qaeda and ISIS is this focus on theological issues because of its polarizing effect. And I do think that there's enough of them there, and guess what? They're mostly in Raqqa, which is coming up in headlines near you, that where we find most of them. That group, I don't think can be persuaded just by finding another messenger. Most of them are going to die in place.
We have a lot of questions, and we're patient with time, so we will try to take as many as we can. This gentleman here, then we'll come here, and then we'll come back to this side of the room.
Hi, Rob Selden, just a concerned citizen. If, as you said, the willingness to die is sort of an endemic component of their belief system, and the willingness to die today, how do they make the decision as to whom to kill? And why didn't they choose to kill you? And if they chose not to kill you, does that mean that they didn't really believe what they believed?
Is this on? Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the question is, why didn't they choose to kill me, and how do they choose who to kill? If they have this kind of totalized belief about their enemies, it includes everyone in this room, I hope, and it would certainly include me when they're talking to me. The belief that someone's blood is permissible, as they would put it, does not, of course, tell them whether they should, either on an individual basis, kill me immediately, or whether they should, on a collective basis, say, attack the Kurds first or the Shia. So they certainly use just tactical savvy, prudence about the targets that they choose. I certainly thought when I would meet someone, especially for the first time, what are the chances that I'm going to be the victim today? For one thing, this is not just true of ISIS, but other groups too. There is, I think, a natural human disinclination to immediately attack someone who's come to you in a spirit of complete openness and who has, at some risk to himself, done that. That's kept me safe in other situations as well. In this one, there was the added safeguard of religion. They knew I was coming to ask them about religion, which is a topic that they are very happy to hold forth on. They viewed me as someone who had approached them as a possible recruit, to be honest, and I think that kept me safe as well. They would often also quote a medium famous hadith that the Prophet has said when asked, what should we do if an infidel comes to us from an enemy camp and asks us about our religion? The answer was, you answer his questions. You answer truthfully and fully, and then once you're done, to make sure that this is not, it's known to them as not being a ruse to get you into a place of insecurity, ask them, do you feel safe where you are? Do you feel like we've answered your questions and that we've let you go in a condition where you can feel comfortable? If the answer is yes, you've done your job and you do have to let them go. So I've had them quote that to me many times as an explanation for why that day wasn't my day.
Hi, I'm Brian Penn, and I work in the State Department. And I was interested to know the State Department, in fact, the whole interagency and the coalition have been engaged in a large counter-messaging effort for the last 2.5 years. I like your evaluation of that. And also your feelings, as you mentioned, as an apocalyptic movement. What if we just gave them their apocalypse and beat them and crush them and in their apocalyptic battle? Do you think would that knock the props from underneath them?
So the first question about counter-messaging, I think it's really been a wash. ISIS has been so good at undercutting the authority of anyone who speaks against them. Certainly the authority of the United States State Department is already zero when speaking to people who are at all vulnerable to recruiting by ISIS. So that just doesn't work so well. ISIS, as I say, when I was describing the authority that was claimed by Yahya Abu Hassan, this autodidact American from Plano who has become a cleric within the Islamic State, his authority was gained by being on the battlefield and by having jihadist opinions that were persuasive to people, not because of where they were, who was voicing them, but because of just being convincing. And then the other question on the apocalyptic side. Yeah, it's very tempting to give them their wish. They say that they expect to defeat a Crusader army at Dabik, and you can actually see why this doesn't actually work out. So they've already lost Dabik, and there was not even really a fight there. They had taken Dabik at some great cost because of its propaganda value and because of true belief that this is a place that was important real estate in the end of time. But when they lost it, they said, contrary to a lot of their previous implications, this wasn't the time when the battle was going to happen. We've always thought that the Battle of Dabik was happening after the fall of Mecca and Medina, for example. So the ability to reinterpret prophecy is very, very strong. By the way, there's this well-known book called When Prophecy Fails that describes in a generalized sense, or tries to, what happens when religious movements come to a point where their specific falsifiable prophecies are indeed falsified. And the conclusion of that study was much as you might think if you've spent any time around cultish movements, that when the falsification happens, it causes many people to become even more confirmed in their crazy belief rather than moving on from it.
Okay, this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Raghuveer Goyal, I'm with India Globe and Asia Today. This is a very timely lecture because we have a new president and new administration. My question is that 67 countries are fighting against ISIL or ISIS and still fighting for the number of years. What is the future, and you think Islamic states are doing enough to stop these terrorists, which are killing millions or affecting millions around the globe? Thanks, sir.
Do I think Islamic states are doing enough to fight against ISIS? I see no reason for them not to, in the sense that they are certainly on the front line of this fight. That Islamic countries, Muslim majority countries, are more acutely targeted and more endangered by ISIS than others, than we are, say. So I do think that the incentives are aligned for the robust response that we would want. The problem is that, as I say, it's not a matter of simply thwarting today's attack. You can do that for some time, but it's not actually addressing the systemic problems. And those of course, are persistent, and the incentives to address them are not fully aligned.
Ma'am.
Elizabeth Graham. You had said a few minutes ago that the flow of foreign fighters towards Syria is reduced. Is that the consequence of a change in strategy for ISIS, or is there some other underlying reason?
There was a particular moment, this question about why the foreign fighter flow has been reduced. Partly is just the capability. The border has become much more difficult to pass because of decisions that have been made. Turkey allowed that border to be porous for quite some time. Now that is not in its interests. I think that's probably the main reason.
Sir?
This is Utsav Chakrabarti from the World Hindu Council. I'm originally from India. There is a theory going that is quite prevalent that what we see as ISIS today is just a manifestation of other radical movement and a more weaponized one. Do you think groups like Tablighi Jamaat, which has one of the highest recruitments for ISIS in Maldives and Central Asia, and Muslim Brotherhood or Jamaat-e-Islami in South Asia, they will continue once ISIS is gone? They will just come up with a new name and a new organization, maybe more weaponized, more geographical.
The question is whether ISIS is a manifestation of other movements that exist, and Tablighi Jamaat was suggested as one of these. In a sense, yes, ISIS has existed in a kind of inchoate form since before the declaration of a caliphate. And my conversations in Cairo with that tailor are a good illustration of this. I mean, everything that he described, he was describing the Islamic State that he did not himself know was going to exist soon. And he, by the way, had close Tablighi associations. They're not identical groups, though. And to say that once ISIS goes away, it'll just rebrand the way that, say, the PKK has, I think is to miss the point of the specific kind of grandiose claims that ISIS has now that don't just flip with change of names or jersey.
Sir, in the back.
Thank you. Chuck Woolery, former chair of the United Nations Association Council of Organizations. You mentioned the word, kind of they were seeking justice 3 different times, and seeking to retrieve injustice at least once. Can you go a little bit more into that, what they meant by that?
Sure. The question is about my use of the word justice, seeking justice. And this is a kind of open, the word justice is open to interpretation here. for them, I don't always know what it means for them to find justice. What was extraordinary to me was to discover how much that concept can change depending on who I was speaking to. So I would speak to British recruits who, when they talked about the justice that the Islamic State represented, I'd say, well, what is that? Well, what is this ideal that you're reaching toward? They'd say, oh, well, they have a working healthcare system. They take care of the poor. They were describing the idealized version of like a British welfare state. They were giving their allegiance to ISIS because they thought ISIS was the fulfillment of British welfarism. So whatever the actual belief of, and I could give other examples of this too. The Texan, he thought of ISIS as a kind of libertarian paradise where everybody can have guns as they wish, and we could go down the line. Cannabis might eventually, once the light was seen by the top muftis, be legalized. We'll see. So the Japanese, not really an ISIS member, but a visitor to ISIS, he described the caliphate as eventually having a respect for privacy, not something normally one associates with ISIS, but that does have precedent in Islamic law. That is, a respect for privacy is something that some of the early caliphs had actually codified in a way. But again, it's whatever justice is, it is something that people see as being inadequate where they are and fulfilled where they are going. That's whatever it is. It was there.
We have had so few occasions in this discussion to even chuckle that I'm going to seize on this one, I think, to close. We have a reception outside where you can feel free to mob Graeme with the many other questions that I see out there without my interference. Let me just take the opportunity, first of all, to congratulate all of the questioners and thank you very much for the brevity and conciseness of your questions. And mostly, of course, to thank Graeme for the superb work that he's done on this very important topic and for a magnificent talk tonight. Thank you, Graeme.